A farmer from Texas was touring England. Imagine. He was with a tour group, and everywhere he went, of course, he kept trying to prove himself by saying how much bigger and better Texas was. The rest of the tour group was, needless to say, getting really fed up. So they asked the tour guide, can you not find some way to get this guy to knock it off? The guide thought a bit, and finally he said, I know just the chap. Then he arranged for the farmer to meet an English farmer. Well, the Texan was delighted because he could hardly wait to get one up on him. When they met, the first thing the Texan asked was, what size farm do you have? The Englishman proudly announced 35 acres. 35 acres, scoffed the Texan. Why, I can get in my truck at 8 in the morning and start driving, and at noon I am still on my farm. I can eat lunch and start driving again, and at 5 in the evening I am still on my farm. Ah, yes, the Englishman nodded sympathetically. I had a truck like that once. Jesus told this story with a very specific group of people in mind. Those who were confident of their own righteousness and looked down on everyone else. He set his story in a very familiar place, the temple. And he chose two characters, a Pharisee and a tax collector. Now, because we are hearing this story with 2,000 years of prejudice built in, it's hard for us to remember that Pharisees were not the bad guys in the first century. We think that everyone hated the Pharisees. We think that Pharisee equals hypocrite. But more often than not, the Pharisees were the ones who were really trying to get it right. They cared about their faith. They sought to uphold the Torah and the oral law against all of the tide of political and social pressure not to. The Sadducees and the Herodians, or followers of Herod, they had bought into the Roman system. They were really beginning to follow all of the ways of Rome. They were the upper class, the aristocracy, and they were being seduced and gradually assimilated in. But not the Pharisees. The Pharisees resisted being Romanized with all their might. They strenuously rejected Rome and its culture. And most Pharisees were respected for their rigorous application of the law, both oral and written. But here's the interesting undercurrent to our story: the oral law. Most of us don't know what that is. It forms the background of virtually every encounter that Jesus had with the Pharisees. The Pharisees believed that the oral law was equal to the written law, and that in fact it had been given at the same time to Moses. But Jesus appears to have not accepted the authority of the oral law at all. He called it human tradition. What exactly is the oral law? Of course, it's been written down, like everything else. It's called the Mishnah. You can find it if you're really having trouble sleeping, because clearly written by lawyers. The Mishnah is a collection of rules about how to keep the law in great, excruciating detail. It is very demanding. The intention was good. The intention was that the oral law was to be a living application of the written law as circumstances changed. That's why it was oral. But as a result of following the oral law, the Pharisees went way over and above the requirements of the Old Testament in their observation of the law. The scene Jesus describes of two men going to the temple and praying out loud would have been typical. People often prayed out loud. It may have happened even during the 3 o'clock service. All services at the temple really involve some kind of atonement for sin, and atonement features in both men's prayers. The Pharisee, because he didn't seem to think he needed it, and the tax collector, because he was well aware of the fact that he did. The tax collector couldn't even lift his head. He beat his breast, a sign of severe distress. And he said, "God, have mercy on me, a sinner." Both men stood a bit apart from the crowd. The Pharisee, because he thought, he was too good for them and they might be contagious of something. The tax collector, because he thought he wasn't good enough and he was ashamed. The tax collector felt broken, as if he had nothing to give other than a desperate plea for mercy. The Pharisee, on the other hand, was a confident overachiever. The written law stipulated that the Jews should fast once a year on the Day of Atonement. The Pharisee fasted twice a week. The written law stipulated that Jews were to tithe the production of their fields. The Pharisee tithed absolutely everything, even his herb garden. Every little tiny thing he had. He was precise and extremely thorough. So when the Pharisee in the story says, "God, I thank you that I am not like other people, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or this tax collector. I fast twice a week and give a tenth of everything I get." Most people listening to Jesus at the time would have thought that that was a reasonable sentiment. Tax collectors were not well thought of, not respected. In fact, they were the enemy. They worked for the Romans. They were collaborators and thieves. But according to Jesus, it was the tax collector who went away home justified, not the Pharisee. Jesus said, "I tell you that this man, rather than the other, went home justified before God. For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted." Jesus' conclusion to the story would have shocked and even offended his hearers. It defied all preconceived ideas of who was good and who was bad. But Jesus was not comparing human achievements. His point was that we are all in need of grace, and we should all approach with humility. On the surface, the Pharisee's the one who seemed righteous. He wasn't selling his people out to the Romans. He was resisting with all his might. But he also wasn't looking to God to justify him, because he had already justified himself. He thanked God for the fact that apparently he had no need of God's grace. And we can see his character revealed in the fact that he said, "I," 4 times. "God, I thank you that I am not like other people, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even this tax collector. I fast twice a week and I give a tenth of all I get. I. The Pharisee claimed to be better than everyone else. He thanked God for that fact. But pay attention to this one particular part of the story. Take note of exactly who it is he compares himself to. I am a world-class athlete if you compare me to a 98-year-old in a coma. But put me next to Simone Biles and I don't quite measure up. It all depends who we are comparing ourselves to. The Pharisee was confident of his own righteousness because he put himself up against the worst in society. Robbers, evildoers, adulterers, tax collectors. That's how self-justification works. When it comes to proving to myself just how much better I am than everyone else, it is always useful to have a list in your mind available of highly imperfect people with which to compare you. After all, if I compare myself to a saintly person, I'm going to come up short. But if I compare myself to a criminal or somebody really dysfunctional, I'm going to look great. It's all who I set myself next to. And that is exactly what the Pharisee did. Instead of recognizing his own inherent sinfulness and need for grace, he relied on the achievement of his legalistic objectives, and he compared himself to the worst. The one who was justified, the one who was truly cleansed of sin, was the tax collector, because he recognized his need and his prayer was heartfelt. He made no excuses. He knew he had done wrong. He asked for forgiveness and he received it. He went home clean. But the Pharisee who trusted in his own ability to keep the law went home still dirty. His heart had not been cleansed. Pride had closed and locked the door. That is the great danger of spiritual pride. Because the nature of a parable is to state things in really extreme forms, we could all very well fall into the temptation today of saying, I thank you, God, that I am not like that Pharisee. We have to look at it for what it is, for what God is really saying to us. Because we all do it, just to a lesser extent. We all compare ourselves to others. And we trust in our own abilities more than we trust in God sometimes. Even if I don't have the Pharisees' obsessive compulsion to obey every aspect of the law, I can take excessive pride in my other accomplishments. The danger is always there, just lurking beneath the surface. But we're not usually aware of our own spiritual pride. It's a huge blind spot for us. So how do we find out if we're guilty of doing what the Pharisee did? How can we know?